Listen, your organs need a constant, completely uninterrupted supply of blood and oxygen just to survive. Honestly, it's the absolute baseline for human life. But what happens when that lifeline is suddenly cut off? Today, we are going to master the hemodynamics and the pathology of shock. If you're an MBBS or nursing student gearing up for exams, or even a future clinician stepping into the wards, this explainer is built specifically for you. We're not just going to sit here and memorize textbook definitions. We're going to learn the underlying mechanisms so you intuitively understand exactly what is happening inside your patient's body. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive right into this. When we look at normal, healthy blood flow, we see this beautifully balanced system delivering oxygen to the tissues and clearing out waste. But when a systemic crisis hits, that circulation suddenly fails. It's a catastrophic shift from physiological balance into a state of absolute total emergency.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that shock is not just low blood pressure. Seriously, that is such a dangerous misconception. Fundamentally, shock is a state of inadequate tissue perfusion. Think of it as a cellular starvation crisis. The cells simply aren't getting the oxygen they need to function, which leads to acute cellular dysfunction. And if that isn't rapidly reversed, it cascades right into multiple organ failure and death. Actually, blood pressure might even look completely normal in the early stages, but make no mistake, the cells are already suffocating.
Real quick, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The basic problem. 2. Hypovolemic and cardiogenic shock. 3. Distributive and obstructive shock. 4. The cellular crisis. And 5. A high-yield exam review.
Section 1. The basic problem. Requirements for perfusion. To truly understand disease and pathology, we first have to understand the baseline normal, right? We need to know what the body actually requires to keep tissues perfectly perfused. Well, there are 4 essential pillars required for normal tissue perfusion. First, you need adequate circulating blood volume. Second, you need an effective cardiac pump to push all that volume. Third, you need appropriate vascular tone, meaning the blood vessels have to be the exact right diameter to maintain pressure. And fourth, the physical pathway for the blood has to be completely unobstructed. If any one of these 4 pillars fails, tissue perfusion drops, oxygen delivery plummets, and your patient enters shock.
Section 2. Hypovolemic and cardiogenic, tank and pump failures.
Let's see how this builds on those 4 pillars by focusing on failures of the blood volume and failures of the heart itself. We are going to start with hypovolemic shock. I want you to visualize the cardiovascular system as household plumbing. In this analogy, hypovolemic shock is simply a tank running out of fluid. There just physically isn't enough volume in the system to go around.
So here's the direct cause and effect pathway. It all starts with a loss of circulating volume. Now this could be hemorrhagic, like from a massive trauma or a bad gastrointestinal bleed, or it could be non-hemorrhagic, like severe dehydration or major burns. Because that volume is lost, decreased venous return leads to a massive drop in preload. Basically, the heart has way less blood to fill its chambers, which causes dropping stroke volume and a decreased cardiac output. The end result? Inadequate tissue perfusion. Now, your body is smart. It tries to compensate by clamping down on the blood vessels, meaning the systemic vascular resistance, or SVR, actually goes up to try and maintain blood pressure, but without fluid, the tank is still empty.
Now let's shift gears and look at cardiogenic shock. In this scenario, the fluid volume is perfectly fine. The tank is full, but the blood may be there and the pump just isn't strong enough to deliver it. The driving force itself is broken.
This pathway begins with primary cardiac dysfunction. The classic textbook and real-world clinical example is a severe myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack. The myocardium is badly damaged, so the heart fails to pump effectively. Because the pump is broken, cardiac output drastically drops. For your exams, lock this hemodynamic marker in your brain. A cardiac index of less than 2.2 liters per minute per square meter. Because the forward flow is so weak, the blood backs up into the venous system. This causes pulmonary edema and an elevated pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, typically over 15 millimeters of mercury. Your patient is quite literally drowning in their own fluid because the pump has failed.
Moving on to Section 3, Distributive and Obstructive, Pipes and Roadblocks.
So we've talked about the tank and we've talked about the pump. Now we need to talk about the vascular pipes and the physical roadblocks in the circulatory system. Welcome to distributive shock. Think of it this way. The tank has normal fluid, the pump is working just fine, but the pipes suddenly become way too wide. The pressure totally drops, and blood distribution completely fails. This is a highly unique hemodynamic state. You know how in hypovolemic or cardiogenic shock the body clamps down? Well, in distributive shock, systemic vascular resistance actually plummets.
The pathway here starts with a massive trigger event. This leads to widespread abnormal vasodilation and altered vascular permeability, which basically means the pipes dilate and get really leaky. This causes a huge maldistribution of blood and a profound drop in effective circulating volume. There are three major subtypes here you absolutely must know. First, septic shock, which is triggered by an overwhelming infection releasing inflammatory mediators and cytokines. Second, anaphylactic shock, triggered by a severe allergic reaction causing massive histamine release. And third, neurogenic shock, typically from a high spinal cord injury that severs the sympathetic nervous system, causing an immediate, total loss of vascular tone.
Finally, we have obstructive shock. To round out our mechanical plumbing analogies, the fluid is there, the pump is trying its absolute hardest to work, but something is physically blocking the road. Here, an acute physical obstruction occurs in the great vessels or even a heart itself. Classic examples include a massive pulmonary embolism completely blocking blood flow to the lungs, a tension pneumothorax crushing the mediastinum, or cardiac tamponade where fluid in the pericardial sac literally squeezes the heart so hard it can't even expand. This obstruction leads to severely impaired ventricular filling or outflow. The result is an immediate drop in cardiac output and severe tissue hyperperfusion. And this brilliantly illustrates why obstructive shock looks hemodynamically so similar to cardiogenic shock. The cardiac output is decreased and blood backs up, causing things like jugular venous distension. But the absolutely crucial difference here is that the heart muscle itself is perfectly fine. It's that physical barrier causing the crisis.
Section 4. Cellular crisis. What happens inside the cells?
Okay, now we are leaving the macro plumbing analogy of tanks and pipes behind, and we are zooming way down to the microscopic cellular level. What is actually killing the patient at the molecular level? It all comes down to metabolism. Under normal, healthy conditions, tissues are perfectly perfused, oxygen is abundant, and cells undergo aerobic metabolism. This is a highly efficient process that produces a whopping 36 ATP molecules, that's the energy currency of the cell, per single glucose molecule. But in shock, oxygen is severely deprived. The cells are forced to shift into anaerobic metabolism. It's a total desperation move. It only produces a measly 2 ATP molecules, creating a massive energy deficit. And as a toxic byproduct, it generates excessive lactic acid. This sets off a deadly sequence we call the hypoxic cascade. First, oxygen delivery falls below critical thresholds. Second, those precious cellular ATP stores are rapidly depleted because that anaerobic glycolysis just cannot keep up. Third, and pay attention, this is incredibly high yield for pathology, the ATP-dependent sodium-potassium pumps on the cell membrane completely fail. Without ATP, sodium just rushes into the cell, water follows it right in, causing massive cellular swelling. Then unregulated calcium floods in, which activates all these destructive enzymes. Ultimately, this leads to irreversible cell injury, multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, and then death. This right here is why treating shock is always a race against time. Section 5. High-Yield Exam Review.
All right, let's gather up all that complex pathophysiology we just covered and synthesize it. If you open up a standard textbook, you're going to see a complex diagram of hemodynamics just like this one. It's incredibly intricate, showing all these overlapping zones of cardiac, distributive, obstructive, and volume loss shock. And while it is definitely important to appreciate just how interconnected human physiology is, let's be real. Staring at this during a stressful exam isn't going to help you quickly diagnose a patient. So let's simplify it down to what you absolutely must know.
Go ahead and screenshot this right now. I'm serious. This is your ultimate high-yield cheat sheet for pathology and internal medicine exams. You have hypovolemic shock, where the main problem is volume loss, seen in hemorrhage or severe dehydration. Cardiogenic shock is pump failure, classically from a massive MI. Distributive shock is widespread vasodilation and maldistribution, seen in sepsis, anaphylaxis, or spinal cord injuries. And finally, obstructive shock is a physical roadblock, like a PE or a tension pneumothorax.
And to make sure this stays locked in your brain forever, just remember our mechanical plumbing analogy. It's so simple. Empty tank equals hypovolemic. Broken pump equals cardiogenic. Wide pipes equals distributive. Blocked road equals obstructive. If you can clearly visualize these four scenarios, the changing hemodynamics, like the cardiac output, the wedge pressures, the vascular resistance, will all become completely intuitive to you.
Before we wrap up,
I want to leave you with a vital, potentially life-saving clinical question to think about. We know that in the early stages, the body goes into overdrive to compensate. Blood pressure might actually look perfectly fine on the monitor, all while the cells are silently starving to death. So if compensated shock maintains a normal blood pressure, how will you spot that hidden cellular crisis before the patient crashes? You never ever wait for hypotension to diagnose shock. You've got to look for the subtle clues: altered mental status, poor capillary refill, an unexplained fast heart rate, and rising lactate levels on their blood gas. Master the pathology, spot the cellular crisis early, and you absolutely will save lives. Thanks for hanging out and learning with us in this explainer, and we will see you in the next one.